It was a bitterly cold afternoon in January 1995 when a 911 call pierced the calm of Burlington, Vermont. On the line was a young man. His voice was cracking, rapid, breathless, on the verge of breaking. "There's blood," he said. "They're not breathing. My whole family. I just got home. Please send someone." By the time police and emergency services arrived at the scene, a modest, two-story townhouse on a quiet street near the edge of town, they found the caller, Daniel Cross, 25 years old, collapsed on the snow-dusted steps, still shaking. Inside the house was a scene that none of the first responders would ever forget. For bodies, all shot at close range. No movement, no signs of life, and chillingly, no sign of a struggle. The victims were Daniel's parents, Dr. Elliot Cross, 56, a respected academic at the local Environmental Research Institute, his wife, Marilyn, 49, a former department store manager, their teenage daughter, Janie, 17, a quiet high school student, and the youngest sibling, Micah, just 21, recently discharged from the army and looking for a new start. All of them were found in different rooms, lying in pools of blood. All shot once in the head. All executed with chilling precision. The only survivor was Daniel. According to his statement, he had spent the night before at his grandparents' place on the far side of the city. That morning, he ran errands, went to the shopping mall, and came home shortly before 2 p.m. What he walked into, he said, was something from a nightmare. Police immediately secured the scene. The Cross home was part of a residential block primarily occupied by professionals and retirees, known for being quiet, safe, even dull. But now, it was cordoned off with yellow tape, and forensics teams were combing through every inch of the modest home. What struck investigators first was how clean everything looked. Too clean. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door had both a solid lock and an additional security gate, both completely intact. The windows were shut tight, locked from the inside, undamaged. Inside, everything seemed ordinary. But the smell of gunpowder still lingered faintly in the air. In the dining area, they found the likely murder weapon, a semi-automatic rifle, model still being verified. It lay on the table, resting quietly as if nothing had happened. Near it, 3 spent shell casings were recovered. A 4th bullet, investigators would later discover, remained chambered and used. The placement of the bodies raised more questions than answers. Dr. Cross was found just outside the master bedroom, as though he had been caught mid-step. His wife lay near the hallway, facing the door to Daniel's room. Janie's body was found at the threshold to that very room, while Micah was discovered near the back door. Each was killed with a single shot to the head. No defensive wounds. No signs of running, struggling, or resisting. Whoever did this knew the house well. They moved quickly, silently. And most disturbing of all, they left without leaving a trace. Detectives initially considered the possibility of a home invasion gone wrong, but that theory quickly fell apart. There were no signs of ransacking, no stolen electronics, no missing valuables. In fact, over $150 in cash and a camera were found untouched in the master bedroom. Whoever entered this home didn't come to steal. They came to kill. And yet, the family's dog, a golden retriever named Scout, had remained tied up in the front yard the entire time. He hadn't barked, hadn't growled. According to neighbors, he'd made no noise that evening. Scout had always been territorial, always loud with strangers. So why didn't he bark that night? Because maybe the killer wasn't a stranger. By early evening, the street was lined with unmarked cars, crime scene vans, and quietly murmuring neighbors behind fences. News spread quickly. A family, a well-respected, admired family, had been wiped out in a matter of minutes. 4 lives lost. Only one spared. And that one, Daniel, had no answers. Or so it seemed. In the immediate aftermath, Daniel was taken in for questioning. Not as a suspect, yet, but as the sole witness, the last known person connected to the family. He repeated the same story. He was out of town the night before. He spent the morning shopping. He returned just after lunch and found the house in chaos. He didn't touch anything. Didn't move the bodies. He called the police immediately. His clothes were clean. No visible wounds. No blood. He cried. He trembled. He cooperated. But some officers, particularly Detective Laura Mendez, felt something off. Not guilt. Not arrogance. But something calculated. Daniel's timeline, while plausible, left a 3-hour gap between 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., where no one could confirm his location. His grandparents said he had left early. Mall employees couldn't place him. Receipts didn't match the timeline precisely. His alibi was just loose enough to raise concern. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. As the day drew to a close, forensics teams continued combing through the house, brushing for prints, checking for DNA, logging every item. But what they kept coming back to was how little there was. All fingerprints belonged to family members. No unknown DNA. No foreign hair. No boot prints. No glass shards. No signs of panic. Even the blood splatter seemed contained and cleaned, especially in the hallway where the two parents had fallen. It was as if someone had tried to erase the crime before it was even discovered. That night, as the snow began to fall again over Burlington, investigators knew one thing for certain. This was no random act. No simple break-in. No drunk dispute gone too far. This was a plan, carried out with precision and confidence. And whether Daniel Cross was a grieving survivor or something far more sinister, they intended to find out. The first thing the detectives wanted to rule out was the simplest explanation: a break-in. Random violence. A robbery gone wrong. Someone breaking into the Cross family home with a weapon and no plan. But the moment they started walking through the property, that theory began to fall apart. There were no broken locks. No shattered windows. No forced entry of any kind. The front door had 2 layers, a sturdy steel security gate and a traditional wooden door. Both were locked when the first officer arrived. Daniel had opened them with his key. The windows were all sealed tight from the inside. No pry marks. No tampering. The back door? Same story. Whoever had entered this house either had a key or had been let in. The investigators took special note of the family dog, Scout, a golden retriever that had been tied just outside the front porch. Scout was friendly with the family but notoriously vocal around strangers. The neighbors could confirm it. He barked at delivery drivers, barked at unfamiliar cars, barked even when the mail came late. But on the night the Cross family was murdered, Scout was silent. No barking. No whimpering. No noise. It was as if whoever walked through that front door that night was someone Scout already knew. Someone familiar. Inside, the house was eerily calm. It didn't feel like a crime scene. It felt like a home that had simply stopped in time. The dining table still had a bowl of fruit at its center. A jacket lay draped neatly over the back of a chair. There was no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. Nothing had been taken, except lives. Even the placement of the murder weapon added to the strangeness. A semi-automatic rifle, lying neatly on the dining room table, as if it had been put there deliberately. Not dropped. Not hidden. Just placed. There were 3 spent shell casings scattered around the room. 1 bullet remained in the chamber. It had never been fired. The theory forming in the minds of the investigators was troubling. The killer had time. Enough time to calmly walk the home, eliminate each member of the family, and then lay the weapon down. More disturbing, they also had the presence of mind to clean. The blood spatter on the hardwood floors was oddly contained. It didn't spread the way it should have in such a violent event. Forensic luminol tests confirmed that the floors had been wiped. Several sections of the hallway and the living room had faint traces of diluted blood, suggesting that a mop had been used. But perhaps the most unsettling clue was that the entire home had been wiped of foreign fingerprints. Every print lifted from the scene belonged to a member of the Cross family. There were no unknown prints, no gloves found, and no evidence of a break-in kit. And so, the logic began to solidify. Whoever did this was either already inside the home, or was someone the family trusted enough to let in. Back at the precinct, Detective Mendez sat in her office reviewing the initial report. The scene was too clean, too efficient. She underlined one line in the file: no valuables missing. She knew from experience that in cases of spontaneous home invasions, There's always chaos. Drawers ripped open, jewelry gone, TVs missing from walls. That wasn't the case here. There had been a superficial ransacking of the master bedroom. Some clothes were pulled from the closet. A drawer had been opened. But $150 in cash inside a locked box was left untouched. Nearby, an expensive camera lay under the bed, undisturbed. Mendez stared at the crime scene photos, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't just about what was taken. It was about what had been staged to look like it had. The scene in the bedroom felt intentional, like someone had gone out of their way to make it seem like a robbery, but lacked the motivation to carry it out. It was a mask. A thin one. As forensic analysts continued to work the case, they made another discovery. The fourth bullet casing was never found. They had 3 spent casings in the living room, 1 live round in the chamber, meaning 4 shots were fired. For people killed. Where was the 4th casing? At first, it was dismissed. It could have been kicked under a piece of furniture. Lost in the heat of the moment. But when they returned the next day with metal detectors and a fresh set of eyes, they turned the house upside down. Still, no casing. And then came the call from the evidence technician. A spent casing had been logged and bagged separately during Daniel's initial questioning. It had been found in the pocket of his jacket, the one he had been wearing when officers arrived at the scene. When asked, Daniel said he had no idea how it got there. "It must have stuck to me," he said. "Maybe I stepped on it, or brushed past something. I didn't even notice it." But Mendez didn't believe in coincidences. Especially not ones that landed shell casings in someone's coat pocket. It wasn't enough to accuse. Not yet. But it was enough to start looking harder. Surveillance footage from the shopping center showed Daniel entering at 11:42 a.m., far later than he had claimed. And more importantly, it showed him alone. No shopping bags. No hurried steps. He had only stayed 15 minutes. From there, no one saw him again until just before 2 p.m., when he called 911. That was over 2 hours of unaccounted time. Plenty of time for murder. Plenty of time to clean up. The detectives turned their focus inward. If Daniel was telling the truth, the killer had vanished without a trace. But if he was lying, then the whole story, the shopping trip, the sudden discovery, the helpless call to 911, was nothing more than a carefully rehearsed performance. They didn't have enough to charge him. But they had something just as valuable. Doubt. And doubt in homicide investigations is always where the real story begins. In every homicide, there's always one moment. The moment where the case shifts. Where questions begin to shape into answers. Where theories turn into conviction. And for the cross-family investigation, that moment came 2 days after the murders, in a quiet back room of the State Forensic Lab. It started with the autopsy report on Janie Cross, the 17-year-old daughter who, by all accounts, had been the most quiet, the most private, and the most protected of the family. She was found near the door to Daniel's room, still in her school clothes, her backpack slung to the side. At first glance, she appeared to be just another tragic victim, an innocent girl caught in a storm far bigger than her. But the autopsy revealed something that no one was prepared for. Alongside the expected trauma from the fatal gunshot wound, the medical examiner noted evidence of long-term sexual activity. Signs of repeated intercourse, not recent, but sustained over time. There was no bruising, no indication of assault on the day of the murder. But there was enough structural trauma to conclude this was not something new. The first reaction from the investigative team was disbelief. Janie was described as quiet, studious, even timid. Her classmates said she never dated. Teachers had seen no signs of rebellion, no late-night calls to parents, no questionable behavior. She was, as one instructor put it, the kind of girl you hope your daughter grows up to be. And yet, her body told a different story. The revelation hit hard. Not because it suggested criminality, but because it shifted the entire motive. Until now, detectives had been chasing theories of revenge, professional vendettas, or maybe even a robbery staged badly. But what if none of those were true? What if the reason this family was murdered was because of something inside the family? Detective Mendez requested an immediate expansion of the background check. They went deeper, interviewing more classmates, female peers, even Janie's teachers in private. One girl, Emily Sutton, a fellow senior, reluctantly came forward. She didn't know much, she said. But she remembered one thing. Janie never talked about boys. But one time, she told me she hated going home on weekends. That line stuck. When Mendez pressed further, Emily added something more unsettling. She said it wasn't safe. I thought she meant emotionally, like her dad was strict. But now, the team pulled Janie's school journals, confiscated from her bedroom. There wasn't much. Pages of essays, random doodles, lists of SAT prep deadlines. But one line, written in faded pencil in the corner of a page, read, "No one believes you when the monster wears a tie." It didn't name anyone. It wasn't evidence. But to Mendez, it was enough to start asking a different kind of question. She began looking at Dr. Elliot Cross, not as a victim, but as a possible predator. A respected scientist, author of several papers on sustainable forestry, former head of his department at the Vermont Institute of Environmental Studies. His record was clean. His colleagues adored him. But behind closed doors? A few quiet voices began to speak up. A former student, now working in New Hampshire, remembered how he had made a few female interns uncomfortable, overly friendly, she said. Too many compliments, too much interest. One staff member remembered an argument between Elliot and his wife Marilyn, late one evening in the parking lot. It wasn't a fight, he said. But she looked cold. Like whatever was said had drained the color from her face. Back at the Cross home, Mendez returned to the bedroom. She looked again, not for blood or weapons, but for signs of Janie's life. Buried under her mattress, she found a notebook. The first half was school notes. The back half, blank. Except for 2 pages, heavily erased and then rewritten. "I'm not real. Not to them. He tells me I'm not theirs anyway. That I owe him everything. That it's our secret." The second page had no words. Just a childlike sketch of a house with bars on the windows. In the upstairs window, a girl with no mouth. Below her, a figure drawn entirely in black. By this point, the investigators were no longer asking why someone had killed the family. They were asking, who knew this secret? Who hated this secret enough to destroy the entire house it lived in? The answer, they suspected, wasn't outside the home. It was inside. Daniel Cross had not been close to Janie. That much was clear. But in the weeks leading up to the murder, neighbors had noted something unusual. The two had been seen talking more. Once in the backyard. Another time at the grocery store. No arguments. No hugs. Just long, serious conversations. At school, Janie had once told her counselor that she was considering applying for early admission to a university in California. When asked why so far away, she said, "I just want out." The counselor never pressed. Now she regretted it. Detectives now had a dark possibility on their hands, that Janie had confided in someone. That her secret wasn't so secret anymore. And if Daniel Cross had learned what had been done to his sister, if he had truly believed what she said, was it possible this wasn't a random massacre or a failed burglary? Was it, in fact, revenge? The problem was, none of this was proof. The physical evidence was thin. No suicide note. No manifesto. Just fragments, shell casings, silent pets, wiped floors, erased names, and now, a girl who had secrets she never got to speak out loud. Mendez looked at Janie's last known phone call. It had been to a prepaid number, no name, no address. The last text on her phone, unsent, read, "I think he knows." Just when the case seemed to be turning inward, closing in around the dark corners of the Cross family home, a new lead pulled it back out into the world. It came in quietly, almost like background noise. A name mentioned offhand by one of Dr. Cross's former colleagues during an informal phone call with detectives. But sometimes it's the smallest ripples that lead to the biggest waves. That name was Victor Langston. Victor wasn't a stranger to Dr. Elliot Cross. In fact, years ago, the two had worked closely at the Vermont Institute of Environmental Studies. Langston had once served as Cross's assistant and later applied for a director role at the same institute, a position he didn't get. And according to those familiar with the incident, Cross had something to do with that. "He torpedoed the whole thing," said one former lab tech. "Spoke against him in the final review. Said he wasn't stable enough to lead." That was in 1992. Since then, Langston had left the academic world, moved into the private sector, and eventually disappeared off most professional records. Rumors swirled. Some said he had opened a struggling wildlife tour company near the Canadian border. Others claimed he'd become reclusive and bitter. But one fact stood out. 3 months before the murders, Victor Langston had made a series of angry phone calls to the Cross residence. Dr. Cross reported the first one himself, a heated voicemail accusing him of destroying people's futures. He didn't report the second or third. Perhaps he didn't think they were worth mentioning. Or perhaps he didn't want anyone digging too deep into the past. Detective Mendez retrieved the voicemails from the phone company archives. The audio was low quality, distorted, but clear enough to make out. "You thought you could humiliate me and walk away? You think I forgot what you did? I'm coming for everything, Elliot. Everything you care about." It wasn't proof of anything. But in a case with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no outside trace, the tone of that message couldn't be ignored. The task force immediately added Langston to their list of persons of interest. His last known address was a cabin on the edge of a forest preserve just north of Montpelier. Remote. Isolated. Off the grid. A place someone could disappear into and never be seen again. When officers arrived, Langston was home. Thin, pale, beard unkempt. The cabin smelled of kerosene and damp wood. He didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, he barely reacted at all when they asked about Dr. Cross. "Man had too many friends in high places," he said with a flat voice. "People like that never fall." Langston claimed he hadn't spoken to Elliot Cross in years. Said he hadn't left the area for months. He denied everything. The phone calls, the threats, any connection to the murders. But there were 2 problems. First, the cell phone tower logs. Langston's phone had pinged near Burlington on January 17th, the night the Cross family was killed. Second, his fingerprints were found, on a wine glass collected from the Cross home's dining room. That glass had been washed, but partial prints still survived. Faded, but matchable. And they matched Victor Langston. He had been there. Langston eventually admitted to it. "Yes," he said. "I had dinner there. Elliot invited me. We talked. Drank wine. It was tense, but it wasn't a fight." When asked why he hadn't mentioned this before, he shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered. I didn't kill anybody." His story raised more questions than it answered. Why would Dr. Cross invite a man who had openly threatened him just months earlier into his home for a drink? Was this an attempt at reconciliation? Or was there something deeper, a mutual agreement, a power dynamic, a secret? Langston insisted that after dinner, he left around 8:30 p.m., drove straight back to his cabin, and didn't talk to anyone for the rest of the night. But here's the catch. No one could confirm that alibi. He lived alone. Had no security cameras. No toll records. No neighbors. Mendez stared at him across the interview table. "Victor," she said, "if you didn't kill them, why didn't you tell us you were there?" Langston didn't blink. "Because you do this. Exactly what you're doing now." For a moment, silence filled the room. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't off the hook either. To verify his account, police administered a polygraph test, standard in cases like this where alibis can't be confirmed. The results were inconclusive. 2 of the 5 control questions showed signs of stress. Not enough for arrest, but enough to raise the heat. Still, something didn't sit right with Mendez. If Langston had done it, why so clean? The Cross home had been wiped down. The crime was surgical, controlled. Langston was erratic, angry, unkempt. His cabin was cluttered and chaotic. He lived surrounded by coffee cans, old wildlife magazines, and broken electronics. Mendez reviewed the crime scene again in her mind. Every room had been staged. Every movement precise. This wasn't the work of a man lashing out in a drunken rage. It was the work of someone who knew the home, knew the routines, and had the time to cover every track. And that, perhaps, was the most damning clue of all. Victor Langston was a ghost from Dr. Cross's past. But maybe that was all he ever was, a shadow. One that loomed, threatened, but ultimately wasn't the hand that pulled the trigger. Back at the station, as Mendez closed Langston's file for the night, she made one note in the corner. Rage leaves a mess. This scene was immaculate. And then she drew a small arrow pointing to a name that had been sitting in the margins since day one. Daniel Cross. Every perfect crime has a crack. And in the case of the Cross family murders, that crack came not from a witness, a confession, or even a mistake in timeline, but from something far smaller. Something brass. Something forgotten. Something that didn't fit. 2 weeks after the murders, when the case had grown heavier, colder, and more politically sensitive, the Burlington Forensic Lab completed a reconstruction of the weapon used in the killings. A semi-automatic Ruger Mini 14 rifle registered to Dr. Elliot Cross himself. The rifle had fired 4 rounds, consistent with the 4 gunshot victims. 3 spent casings had been recovered in the dining and living areas. But where was the 4th casing? The answer came from an unusual source, the crime scene video footage, recorded just minutes after first responders arrived. A young tech reviewing the footage paused on a frame taken from Daniel's room. Just behind his bedroom door, hidden near the baseboard heater, was a glint of brass. For days it had gone unnoticed. The initial walkthroughs had focused on visible surfaces, major blood trails, high traffic zones. No one had checked the back corner of the bedroom where the final shot, Micah's, had likely occurred. Officers returned to the home with a small flashlight and a pair of tweezers. There it was, the 4th shell casing. But here's where things got strange. Unlike the others, this casing was not ejected cleanly. It had scratches along the rim, as if it had jammed in the chamber before being expelled. And it was found separate from the other 3, which had been collected from a visibly cleaned floor. That's when the lab made the crucial observation. This casing didn't match the cleanup pattern. The others had been fired, ejected, and either left or swept. But this one had jammed, been manually cleared, and ended up behind a closed bedroom door. And whoever handled it didn't clean it. Even more telling, under microscope, the casing had a partial smudge, not enough for a full fingerprint, but enough to suggest someone had tried to pick it up with their bare hands, and failed. This shell was the mistake. The oversight. The only trace of real human error in an otherwise robotic scene. Detective Mendez reviewed the updated forensic report, her pen tapping the desk in rhythm. She circled 2 words in red ink. Manual clearance. That meant the shooter knew how to handle the weapon. It wasn't random fire. It wasn't panic. The shooter had the presence of mind to clear a jammed round, something that required at least basic weapons training. And in that moment, her attention shifted back, again, to Daniel Cross. Not just because of motive. Not just because of opportunity. But because of knowledge. Daniel had military exposure. A brief summer ROTC program in high school. Basic firearms training. The kind of resume bullet point most parents mention with pride. It had never seemed relevant until now. Because Dr. Cross's rifle wasn't simple to use. It wasn't a basic handgun someone could stumble their way through. It was a precision weapon that required loading, sighting, breathing control. And the shooter hadn't just fired it. They had cleared it. Mendez flipped through Daniel's statement for the 3rd time. When I got home, the door was locked. I went inside, saw my mother first. Then I turned the corner, saw the others. I panicked. I ran. It was clean. Almost rehearsed. But something else had bothered her from the beginning. The way Daniel spoke about the weapon. He said, "They used my dad's gun." That was said before forensics confirmed the weapon belonged to Dr. Cross. Before anyone released that detail publicly. How did Daniel know? She decided to go back to the original 911 call. The full recording, not the transcript. And there it was. Right in the middle of his panicked rambling. They're all shot. It's my dad's rifle. I don't know how. Oh my God. It's all blood. He hadn't even seen the rifle yet. He claimed to have run out immediately. But his voice said otherwise. His words betrayed him. He knew what weapon was used. He knew where it came from. And now, he was the only person known to have both access and knowledge to use it. The timeline was also unraveling. Daniel claimed to have returned home around 1:50 p.m. But store security footage showed him at the local shopping mall at 11:42 a.m., staying only 15 minutes. That left over 2 hours unaccounted for. The route from the mall to the house took just 11 minutes by bike, which meant Daniel had time to return home, clean the weapon, wipe the floors, stage the ransacking, hide evidence, leave again, return at 2 p.m. in shock. Too much of it aligned. Mendez knew it was time to bring Daniel in again. But not for an interview this time. For a confrontation. They brought him back into the interview room. Same concrete walls, same silver table. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't smile. Instead, she pulled a clear evidence bag from her file. Inside it, the fourth casing. She placed it in the center of the table, between them. Said nothing. Daniel looked at it. Then he looked up. And for the first time, he didn't speak. For a long time, Daniel Cross said nothing. The evidence bag sat between them, clear plastic, slightly wrinkled from handling, with a single brass casing inside. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. Detective Mendez waited. Daniel's fingers twitched once, then steadied. He didn't touch the casing. He didn't reach for water. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just stared. Mendez leaned forward, voice low, steady. Tell me how it jammed, Daniel. That's when the air in the room changed. Not suddenly, but slowly, like a room losing heat. Daniel closed his eyes. For a second, Mendez thought he might cry. But when he opened them again, they were dry. And cold. You ever wonder what it's like to live in a house, he said, where you're always just background noise? She didn't answer. He wasn't talking to her anymore. He was talking to someone else. Maybe his father. Maybe himself. You grow up in it and at first, it's normal. You tell yourself it's just how families are. Your dad doesn't ask how school went. Your mom forgets your birthday. You live with your grandparents for 5 years, and when you come back, it's like no one remembered you left. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It was flat, like a confession rehearsed for years. I watched them. Every day. Mom cutting fruit only for Micah. Dad praising Janie for being quiet and smart. Janie got a new coat every fall. I wore the same hoodie for 3 winters. He finally looked up. I wasn't angry at first. Just waiting for it to change. Mendez kept her hands folded on the table. Didn't interrupt. But it never did. And after a while, you stop waiting. You just watch. Every small thing. Every laugh you weren't part of. Every dinner you weren't told about. You start adding it up like math. And one day, the numbers stop making sense unless you subtract the people. He let that sentence hang in the air. Then he said something Mendez didn't expect. It wasn't Janie I wanted to kill. He paused. It was him. Just him. She knew who he meant. Dr. Cross. He nodded. He wasn't just a bad father. He was something else. Mendez opened a folder, pulled out a photocopy of Janie's notebook entry. No one believes you when the monster wears a tie. Daniel saw it. Didn't flinch. She told me 2 weeks before it happened, he said. I didn't believe her. I didn't want to. His hands clenched together. She said he wasn't her real dad. That mom told her not to talk about it. That he'd been doing things since she was 12. He swallowed, looked away. She said she didn't feel human anymore. That she felt like a room people walked through without looking around. Mendez didn't speak. Daniel's voice dropped. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling thinking, I have to tell someone. But who? The police? My mom. He laughed once, bitter. She already knew. That part broke something in his voice. I told her. And she just said, it would ruin everything. She's not really ours anyway. He leaned back slowly, exhausted. You know what that sounds like? When your mother tells you that your sister doesn't matter, that what happened to her isn't worth talking about. Mendez finally spoke. Quietly. What happened after that? Daniel looked down at the casing again. I started planning. Not revenge. Just removal. I wanted them gone. All of them. Even Janie. Not because I hated her. but because she was part of the story. And I didn't want to live in that story anymore. The next part came like a list. Like he'd recited it to himself before. I cleaned the gun the night before. Found the ammo in the drawer beneath Dad's ties. I knew he kept it hidden there, he thought it was clever. I practiced loading it with gloves. Just in case. He looked straight at Mendez now. I didn't want it to be messy. I wanted it quiet. No screaming. No one running. Just silence. His eyes flicked toward the door. Maybe toward the past. Dad came home first. He always checked the rooms one by one. I waited behind the bathroom door. When he passed, I fired. His tone didn't change. Mom came 20 minutes later. She set her purse down, called Janie's name. She was heading for her room. I stepped out from behind the kitchen wall and shot her in the back. His voice dipped lower. Janie came next. She paused at the hallway like she always did, checking the thermostat. She turned around when she saw the light on in my room. I was waiting. I didn't let her speak. And then, Micah wasn't supposed to come home. He texted he was out. But I told him I was at the mall and that Mom needed help with dinner. He walked in like he always did. Dropped his bag. Took off his boots. Walked right into it. There was no triumph in his words. No grief either. Just resignation. Mendez waited for a sign of remorse. But all Daniel said was, I cleaned everything. I mopped. I wiped the floors. I turned off the lights. Put the gun on the table like it didn't matter anymore. She leaned forward. But the casing. I missed it, he said bitterly. The fourth one jammed. I pulled it out fast. Must have dropped it. I thought I had them all. Silence. Mendez closed her folder. Looked at him one last time. You planned everything. Daniel nodded. And I would have gotten away with it too, he said softly, if I hadn't missed one piece. He tapped the evidence bag once. One piece. On the morning of March 6, 1996, after months of investigation, interrogation, and public speculation, Daniel Cross was officially indicted for the murders of his parents, sister, and younger brother. He was 25 years old. The trial was short. The evidence, once elusive, was now overwhelming. The bullet casing, the altered timeline, the knowledge of the weapon, the confession. He did not plead insanity. He did not attempt to blame anyone else. In court, he sat still, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed forward. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood, paused, and said only, "They weren't my family. I was just living in their house." The courtroom fell silent. There was no media frenzy. No sobbing relatives. Most of the Cross family's extended circle had already distanced themselves. What could they say? How could they explain that a son had erased an entire bloodline? On April 2, 1996, Daniel Cross was sentenced to death by lethal injection by the Vermont Superior Court. He waived all appeals. He did not request a stay. He did not speak to reporters. He returned to his cell quietly, as though he had already accepted that the life he had destroyed was never truly his to begin with. But the story didn't end in that courtroom. Because this case, unlike most, was never just about violence. It was about absence. About what happens when love is conditional, when attention is selective, when silence is treated as protection. Daniel wasn't born a monster. He was born into neglect. For years, he was the forgotten one. Shuffled between relatives. Left out of school photos. Treated as the extra seat at the table, not a son. He was there, but not seen. Speaking, but not heard. And when Janie finally trusted him with her secret, he didn't see it as something to report. He saw it as the final betrayal in a lifetime of erasure. Dr. Elliot Cross may have been a respected figure in the academic world, but behind closed doors, he was a tyrant cloaked in intellect. Marilyn, the mother who stood by, chose silence over confrontation. And Janie, the one most wronged, had no safe place to run. Not even to the brother who would eventually pull the trigger. Micah? The youngest? He was never meant to be part of it. But Daniel's plan couldn't survive an eyewitness. He killed to end a story, not to begin one. But what Daniel didn't realize was that his silence, the silence he'd endured for decades, wouldn't end with the gunshots. It would echo. Through neighbors who never asked questions. Through schools that missed the signs. Through friends who saw the distance, but never the reason. He was the survivor in name only. The truth was, that house hadn't had survivors for years. It just took a massacre to make it clear. In the months after the sentencing, the Cross family home was boarded up. Eventually sold. New residents moved in. Painted over the walls. Laid down new flooring. Planted tulips where the front steps used to be stained with snow and tragedy. But in the basement, on a beam behind the water heater, a faint pencil line still remained. Just 4 words. Written by a child's hand. Barely visible unless you looked closely. I don't feel real. The boy who wrote that had disappeared long before the crime. And the man who confessed was never truly born. Sometimes, the scariest stories aren't about strangers breaking in. They're about what happens when the people already inside stop seeing you as family. About what happens when a house becomes a prison. When rooms carry secrets. And silence becomes the deadliest sound of all. This wasn't just a family murder. This was a home that never was.